The county fair arrived in the Tennessee mountains the same way it always did, quietly, predictably, like a promise the town made to itself every summer. By late afternoon in 1997, the gravel lot at the edge of the valley was already filling with pickup trucks dusted in red clay. Hand-painted signs pointed families toward the entrance. The air carried the smell of frying oil, sugar, and hay. For one night, the mountains loosened their grip, and the people came down into the open. Daniel Harper drove. He always did. At 24, he was the oldest of the cousins, and the one everyone trusted to keep things on track. Luke sat beside him, longer-limbed, quieter, 22 and freshly out of trade school. Ethan rode in the back, restless, 20 years old and still deciding what kind of man he wanted to be. Emily squeezed in next to him, 18, recently graduated, the youngest, but never treated that way. They'd grown up together in neighboring hollows, family ties braided tight by shared holidays and shared losses. In a place like this, cousins were closer than friends. They parked near the tree line just before sunset. Witnesses would later remember the four of them stepping out together, laughing about something unimportant. Emily wore a denim jacket tied around her waist. Daniel slapped the side of the truck before locking it, a habit he never broke. Nothing about that moment stood out. Nothing about it felt like a beginning. Inside the fairgrounds, time moved differently. The music from the stage blurred into the mechanical clatter of rides. Children ran loose, faces sticky with cotton candy. Vendors shouted over one another. The cousins moved as a unit at first, drifting from booth to booth. Funnel cakes came first, powdered sugar dusting their hands and clothes. Someone snapped a photo near the Ferris wheel, all four of them framed by lights that hummed as night crept closer. People remembered them because they looked familiar. The Harpers had been coming to this fair for years. Daniel stopped to talk to a man he knew from a logging crew. Luke ran into an old classmate near the livestock pens. Emily lingered at a jewelry stall, fingers tracing handmade silver rings. For a few minutes, Ethan disappeared toward the game booths, determined to win something cheap and ridiculous. These separations were brief, ordinary, the kind of small moments no one thinks to hold on to. Around 9 o'clock, the fair reached its loudest point. The main ride spun faster. The band played its last set, beer cups piled up near the edge of the grounds. It was around this time that a volunteer working parking detail noticed the cousins again. They were standing near the boundary fence, not quite leaving, not quite staying. Daniel seemed tense. Luke leaned in close, listening. Emily's posture was rigid, her arms folded across her chest. The volunteer would later tell deputies he overheard raised voices, not from the cousins, but from two men standing a short distance away. He didn't recognize them. One wore a dark jacket despite the heat. The other kept glancing toward the tree line. The exchange was brief, clipped, and low enough that only fragments carried. A name, a sharp laugh, then silence. At the time, it didn't register as important. Fairs attracted outsiders. Tempers flared. People drank. The volunteer looked away when another car pulled in crooked. Sometime after 10, witnesses recalled seeing the cousins walk toward the far end of the fairgrounds, where the lights thinned and the music faded. The path they took wasn't marked for foot traffic. It led past maintenance sheds and an unlit service road that curved toward the parking area. Daniel's truck was parked beyond that bend, closer to the trees than the main lot. He'd said it was easier to leave that way, less traffic, less waiting. A woman running a kettle corn stand watched them go. She remembered Emily turning back once, scanning the crowd as if she were looking for someone. She remembered Daniel lifting a hand, signaling they were fine. The cousins disappeared into the dim stretch between light and dark. That was the last confirmed sighting. By 11, the fair began to thin. Families loaded tired children into cars. Vendors counted cash under bare bulbs. By midnight, the gates were closed. The gravel lot emptied until only a few vehicles remained. Daniel's truck sat exactly where he'd left it, doors locked, nothing disturbed, no footprints in the dust leading away, no sign that anyone had returned. At first, no one noticed. It wasn't unusual for people to linger, to leave with friends, to take back roads home. Cell phones in 1997 were inconsistent at best, and the mountains swallowed signals whole. It wasn't until morning that absence turned into alarm. Emily didn't come home. Neither did Daniel, Luke, or Ethan. By 8 a.m., calls began crossing county lines. Parents checked with one another, voices tightening as answers failed to come. Someone drove back to the fairgrounds. Daniel's truck was still there, silent in the daylight. Deputies arrived just after 9. They walked the perimeter slowly, scanning the tree line, the service road, the shallow ditches. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken branches, no dropped belongings. It looked, on the surface, like 4 young adults had simply vanished between the fair and their vehicle. The initial assumption was simple and comforting. The cousins had probably wandered into the mountains. Maybe they'd been drinking. Maybe they'd taken a shortcut that turned into a long night hike. People got turned around out there all the time. Search and rescue could be assembled. They would be found tired, embarrassed, but alive. Families were told to wait. By noon, word spread through the community. By evening, the waiting curdled into fear. No one had heard from them. No one had seen them leave together or separately. The mountains stood quiet, indifferent, as if nothing had passed through at all. And somewhere between the fading music of the fair and the first search grid drawn on a map, the last normal night ended, without anyone realizing just how far into the dark it had already gone. By the second morning, the assumption that the 4 cousins had simply wandered off no longer felt solid. The Tennessee mountains have a way of correcting false hope quickly. When daylight came and there were still no signs of Daniel, Luke, Ethan, or Emily, law enforcement shifted from waiting to searching, and the tone of the valley changed with it. Deputies from the county sheriff's office established a command point near the fairgrounds. Folding tables were set up under open sky. Maps were spread out and weighed down with coffee cups and radios. The search began close to where the cousins were last seen, then radiated outward in widening circles that followed logic more than instinct. If they'd walked toward the truck, they would have passed the service road. If they'd missed the turn, they could have followed it deeper into the trees. If alcohol or darkness played a role, they might have drifted downhill toward water. Volunteer firefighters arrived first, then park rangers familiar with the terrain. K-9 handlers followed, their dogs eager but already struggling. The ground near the fairgrounds was trampled by hundreds of feet. Scents overlapped. Tire tracks cut through footprints. By the time the dogs were brought in, whatever trail might have existed had been diluted beyond clarity. Search teams moved methodically across wooded ridges, down into creek beds where sound travels strangely, and along abandoned logging paths that hadn't been maintained in decades. These routes looked passable on paper, but disappeared into brush in reality. Old markers lay half-buried. The mountains didn't give up their history easily. As the hours passed, investigators began collecting statements, hoping human memory might provide what the land would not. That's when the story started to fracture. A woman who ran a food stand near the maintenance area insisted she saw the cousins arguing with 2 men just before they left. She described raised voices, aggressive body language, and Emily stepping back as if uncomfortable. But she couldn't give names. She couldn't say what was said, and she admitted she hadn't thought to report it until she heard they were missing. A teenage boy told a deputy he saw a dark-colored van idling near the service road with its lights off. He said it struck him as strange because it wasn't parked in a designated area. But when asked for details, the description blurred. He couldn't remember the license plate. He wasn't sure of the make. He'd been distracted, half paying attention, already on his way home. A carny, packing up equipment late that night, recalled seeing Emily earlier than others remembered. He said she looked upset, her smile gone, her steps quick. He assumed it was a boyfriend problem. He didn't see who she was with when she left the midway. None of these accounts lined up cleanly. Each suggested tension, but none pointed in the same direction. Investigators logged them anyway, aware of how unreliable memory becomes once fear enters the picture. Days turned into a week. The search grid expanded farther into the mountains, even as confidence in certain areas faded. Steep ravines were searched twice. Shallow streams were walked inch by inch. Helicopters were requested, but limited by budget and weather. Every decision about where to search and where to stop carried weight, and every choice risked being the wrong one. Terrain worked against everyone. Scent pools collected in low areas, confusing dogs. Wind carried traces uphill, then scattered them. The ground itself told no story. No clothing, no dropped wallet, no broken phone. It was as if 4 people had reached the edge of the fairgrounds and dissolved into the air. Families watched all of this with growing unease. At first, they waited quietly, trusting the process. By the second week, patience thinned. Emily's mother demanded to know why certain trails weren't being searched again. Daniel's father questioned why investigators seemed convinced the cousins had walked off willingly. Tension rose at briefings, voices cracking with exhaustion and grief. Law enforcement, bound by procedure, pushed back. Resources were limited. Leads were thin. They couldn't chase rumors without evidence. The mountains were vast. They reminded families that no signs of foul play had been found. The absence of evidence, however, felt cruel rather than reassuring. Media attention peaked early. Local news stations ran updates with aerial shots of search teams moving through trees that all looked the same. Reporters repeated the ages, the names, the last known movements. Then, slowly, the updates became shorter. Other stories took precedence. Without new information, the disappearance slipped from the headlines and into the margins. Behind the scenes, the tone shifted. Search and rescue protocols began to change language. If found quietly became if located. Focus moved from immediate survival to long-term possibilities. Investigators documented areas already cleared and started closing them off, not because they were certain the cousins weren't there, but because they had nowhere else to go. Weeks passed without a single confirmed trace. By the end of the month, the official operation was scaled back. Volunteers returned to their jobs. Rangers moved on to other calls. What remained was a file thick with statements that didn't agree, maps marked with empty circles, and 4 families left staring at a silence that felt deliberate. The case wasn't closed. It wasn't solved. It was simply suspended, hanging between what people believed and what could be proven. And as the mountains settled back into stillness, the question that lingered was no longer how the cousins got lost, but whether they had ever been lost at all. As summer turned into fall, the fairgrounds returned to what they had always been, an empty stretch of gravel bordered by trees, quiet except for the wind moving through the valley. The rides were gone. The lights were dismantled. Only faint tire marks remained, slowly erased by rain. But the disappearance of Daniel, Luke, Ethan, and Emily did not fade with the season. It settled into the community, heavy and unresolved, shaping conversations even when no one spoke their names out loud. In the months that followed, the story began to change. At first, people repeated facts, last sightings, search efforts, timelines. But facts alone couldn't fill the silence, and slowly, speculation took their place. Rumors started at gas stations, in church parking lots, along the edges of high school football games. Someone claimed to know a shortcut through the mountains that never showed up on county maps. Someone else mentioned an abandoned property farther up the ridge, owned years ago by a contractor who kept to himself and avoided town events. Names were rarely spoken directly. The community had a way of suggesting without accusing. It was safer that way, safer to hint than to point. Law enforcement heard the same rumors. Detectives logged them carefully, noting patterns that repeated too often to ignore. The isolated property, the reclusive man, the unmarked trails that cut through private land and disappeared into dense timber. Investigators quietly drove those roads, parked at gates, and walked what they were legally allowed to walk. They knocked on doors with polite questions and neutral expressions. Nothing crossed the line into probable cause. No witness could place the cousins on any property beyond the fairgrounds. No physical evidence tied anyone to their disappearance. Every lead stopped just short of what the law required. Warrants were never signed. Files grew thicker, but progress did not. Inside the family's homes, time moved differently. Daniel's bedroom stayed exactly as he left it. His father dusted around the edges, but never touched the bed. Luke's mother folded his clothes once, then unfolded them again, unable to commit to the idea that he wouldn't need them. Ethan's siblings stopped asking when he was coming home, then stopped talking about him altogether. They grew older, graduated, left town. Hope didn't disappear all at once. It thinned, stretched, and eventually became something quieter and harder to explain. Emily's mother kept her phone number active long after friends suggested it was pointless. Every few months, she called it herself just to hear the voicemail greeting. Emily's voice stayed frozen at 18, cheerful and casual, promising to call back soon. Changing it felt like erasing her. Letting it go unanswered felt like betrayal. By the 1-year mark, the case was no longer urgent to anyone outside the families and a handful of detectives. It had been officially classified as a cold case, a term that sounded clinical and detached, but in reality meant that nothing new was expected. Investigators still reviewed tips when they came in, but most were recycled versions of old rumors, sharpened by time and fear. Then, nearly a year after the fair, something surfaced. A fisherman walking along a creek several miles downstream noticed a backpack lodged against a cluster of rocks. It wasn't waterlogged. The fabric wasn't torn. Inside were items that hadn't degraded the way they should have if they'd been in the water for months. The backpack was identified as Ethan's. For a brief moment, hope surged again. Deputies returned to the area. The creek was searched upstream and down. The surrounding banks were examined. Nothing else was found. No tracks, no remains. No explanation for how the backpack had traveled that far without showing signs of prolonged exposure. Officially, it was ruled unrelated, possibly placed there later, possibly moved by someone passing through, possibly nothing at all. To the families, it felt like something worse than nothing. It felt deliberate. Investigators noted the inconsistency privately. The backpack didn't fit the narrative of an accidental disappearance. It also didn't fit any theory they could prove. Without additional evidence, it became another unanswered question added to a growing list. As years passed, the community's tone shifted. People grew tired of the questions. New families moved in who didn't remember the fair in 1997. Longtime residents learned which topics to avoid. When outsiders asked about the cousins, answers came carefully measured, stripped of detail. The disappearance became a story people knew but didn't want to carry anymore. Law enforcement felt the pressure too. Open cases reflect unsolved failures, even when circumstances are impossible. Supervisors encouraged closure where possible. Files were reviewed, summarized, and archived, but certain inconsistencies refused to disappear, statements that never aligned. Witnesses who had changed their stories subtly over time, the absence of evidence where something should have existed. Those details were documented quietly, flagged for future review, and then left untouched. Years stacked on top of years. The fair returned every summer. New rides replaced old ones. Children who hadn't been born in 1997 rode the Ferris wheel under the same lights. Parents watched them closely, remembering something they didn't always explain. For the families, grief became a constant rather than an event. It shaped holidays, altered conversations, and redefined what closure meant. They learned to live without answers while never fully accepting the absence. The case of the four cousins remained open in name only. No arrests, no remains, no definitive theory. Just a disappearance that refused to fit cleanly into accident or crime, and somewhere beneath the layers of rumor, silence, and time, the truth waited, undisturbed, undocumented, and dangerously close to being forgotten altogether. 18 years is long enough for most people to stop expecting answers. By 2015, the disappearance of Daniel, Luke, Ethan, and Emily Harper had become a file number more than a memory inside the sheriff's office. The paper had yellowed. The ink had faded. The detectives who first worked the case had either retired or moved on. What remained was a thin promise written at the top of the folder, open, unsolved. The mountains, however, do not forget in the same way people do. That summer, a construction crew was contracted to clear an abandoned cabin high along a ridgeline, several miles from the old fairgrounds. The structure had been deemed unsafe, partially collapsed after years of neglect. It sat on land that had changed hands twice since the late 90s, each owner assuming the cabin was little more than a forgotten hunting shelter. When the crew began pulling up rotted floorboards, they expected debris. What they didn't expect was intention. Beneath a section of collapsed wood, wedged between damp soil and splintered beams, lay a small cluster of items that didn't belong to the cabin's decay. Rusted hand tools, a length of cord, and beneath them, pressed flat and folded once, a photograph. It was torn nearly down the middle. Time had softened the edges. Moisture had warped the surface. But the image itself was still clear enough to recognize immediately. Four young people stood close together, smiling into the camera. Fairground lights glowed behind them. Daniel's arm was slung casually over Luke's shoulder. Ethan leaned forward slightly, mid-laugh. Emily stood at the edge, her head tilted just enough to catch the light. The other half of the photograph was missing. Not lost. Ripped. The crew reported the find within the hour. When detectives arrived, they handled the photograph carefully, aware that anything left untouched for that long deserved respect. Back at the lab, forensic technicians examined the paper stock, the ink saturation, the chemical makeup of the print. The results were precise. Late 1990s, consistent with inexpensive one-hour photo processing common at the time. Nothing about it contradicted what it appeared to be. The photograph had been taken the night of the fair. More troubling was the reverse side. Faint but present, a partial fingerprint had survived. Not enough for an immediate match, but enough to log, preserve, and compare against anyone who had ever been connected to the case. The cabin's location reopened a door many thought was sealed. Records showed the property once belonged to a former contractor who lived alone and kept to himself. He had been interviewed briefly in the early days of the investigation after someone mentioned seeing him near the fairgrounds that night. No evidence tied him to the cousins. No follow-up occurred. He sold the property a few years later and died before the case was ever revisited. At the time, he was one of several people investigators spoke to. In hindsight, the list narrowed. Cold case detectives were assigned quietly. There was no press release, no announcement to families yet. The photograph changed the tone instantly. This was no longer a disappearance without trace. Someone had taken that photo. Someone had kept it. Someone had hidden it. Re-interviews began with witnesses who had once offered incomplete answers. This time, detectives didn't ask broad questions. They focused on inconsistencies. They allowed silence to linger. They presented timelines instead of accusations. One witness admitted something they had never put into words before: fear. They had recognized one of the men near the maintenance road that night, a local figure with a reputation no one wanted to challenge. They had convinced themselves it was safer to stay quiet, especially when nothing could be proven. Another witness finally clarified the argument overheard near the edge of the fairgrounds. It wasn't random, it wasn't drunken noise. One of the cousins had recognized someone. There was history, something unresolved, something that didn't belong in a public place. The pieces began to align in ways they hadn't 18 years earlier. Back then, each statement existed in isolation. Now, with distance and the photograph anchoring the timeline, patterns emerged. The partial fingerprint was run again. Technology had advanced. Databases were larger. This time, there was a hit. Not definitive enough for a public declaration, but strong enough to confirm what detectives already suspected. The photograph hadn't been kept as a souvenir. It hadn't been hidden by accident. It was a reminder, preserved and concealed beneath a floor that was never meant to be lifted again. Families were notified carefully. No promises were made, only facts. The image, the location, the renewed investigation. For some, it reopened wounds that had never truly closed. For others, it was the first real sign that the truth might still be reachable. The community reacted differently this time. Less speculation, more unease. The cabin's location circulated quietly. People connected dots they'd once refused to draw. Silence no longer felt protective. It felt complicit. As detectives prepared warrants and coordinated next steps, one truth settled in unmistakably. The cousins had not vanished into the mountains. They had been taken out of sight, and for 18 years the proof had waited in the dark, pressed flat beneath a broken floor, until the ground itself finally gave it back. The warrant was signed quietly, without ceremony, on an overcast morning that felt heavier than most. By then, detectives no longer spoke in hypotheticals. The photograph, the fingerprint, the revisited statements, all of it had shifted the case from possibility to probability. What remained was to confirm what everyone already sensed, but no one had yet said out loud. The cabin sat where it always had, unchanged by time except for decay. Crews moved carefully now, not as laborers, but as custodians of evidence. Survey flags marked grids around the structure. Soil samples were taken in measured increments. Every footstep was logged. The mountains that had once swallowed the truth were being asked, methodically, to give it back. Behind the cabin, beyond a line of overgrowth that looked natural to anyone not trained to question it, the ground sloped downward into a shallow ravine. It was the kind of place rainwater collected briefly before draining away. Easy to overlook. Easy to assume it had already been searched decades earlier, when in reality it had never fallen within any official grid. The first fragment was found just below the surface. At first, technicians weren't certain what they were seeing. Time had done what time always does. Bones were scattered, incomplete, fragmented by weather, animals, and gravity. But placement told a story. These were not remains carried here by chance. They had been put here. DNA testing followed quickly, with a speed unavailable in 1997. The results came back in stages, each confirmation landing harder than the last. Daniel Harper, Luke Harper, Ethan Harper, Emily Harper. 18 years of uncertainty ended in a single report. The manner of death could not be reconstructed fully. Too much had been lost, but enough remained to understand the shape of the crime. There were no signs consistent with accidental exposure. No evidence they had wandered and succumbed to the elements. Trauma patterns suggested restraint, movement, control. Investigators reconstructed the timeline backward, the fair, the maintenance road, the service path that curved out of sight. Witness statements, once dismissed as unreliable, now fit together with unsettling clarity. The suspect had known the area intimately. He knew where lights faded and where sound didn't carry. He knew how to speak to people without drawing attention. Behavioral analysts concluded what detectives had begun to accept. The fair was not coincidence. It was opportunity. For years, the suspect had blended into events like this, a familiar face, or at least a non-threatening one. Someone who understood how isolation worked in crowded places. The cousins were targeted not because they were vulnerable individually, but because they trusted one another. That trust made them predictable. Emily's presence mattered. The torn photograph explained what words could not. It was not a keepsake. It was leverage, proof. The image captured the moment before control was established, before resistance became impossible. Keeping half of it meant something else had been removed, not out of sentiment, but intention. The photograph was never meant to be seen again. Jurisdictional reviews followed. Hard questions were asked internally. Why certain properties were never fully searched. Why early witness accounts weren't pressed harder. Why technology that didn't exist then might have changed everything now. The answers were uncomfortable but honest. Limited resources, incomplete databases, legal thresholds that could not be crossed without evidence. In 1997, investigators worked with what they had, not with what hindsight demanded. Families were notified privately before any public statement was made. They were brought into quiet rooms, shown reports. Given time no one could ever give back. Grief resurfaced in forms that surprised even those who thought they were prepared. Some felt relief. A confirmation, even a devastating one, ended the endless waiting. Others felt rage, not just at the man responsible, but at the years stolen by silence and delay. Closure did not arrive as a single emotion. It arrived fractured, uneven, and heavy. The suspect, already deceased, would never face trial. No confession would be entered. No courtroom would hear the names spoken aloud in sequence. Justice, in its most traditional form, had expired with him. What remained was truth. The mountains had hidden it well. For nearly 2 decades, they held the evidence in place, unremarkable and undisturbed. And when it finally surfaced, it did not bring peace so much as it brought clarity. A clarity that demanded to be acknowledged, even as it opened the final, unavoidable question of what closure truly means when justice comes too late. The official report was finalized quietly, bound in plain folders, and entered into a system that had carried the case for nearly 2 decades without answers. This time, there were no question marks at the end of sentences, no conditional language. The status changed from missing to resolved, a word that felt both heavy and incomplete, but the truth, at least, was finally written down in permanent ink. Daniel Harper, Luke Harper, Ethan Harper, Emily Harper. Their names appeared together again, not on flyers taped to telephone poles or in fading newspaper clippings, but in a formal conclusion that acknowledged what had happened and why the waiting had lasted so long. For the families, seeing the names listed that way carried a strange weight. It was validation and loss combined, proof that they had never imagined the danger, and confirmation that nothing would ever undo it. The press learned of the findings days later. By then, the families had already been through the hardest part. They had heard the facts without filters, without softened language meant for public consumption. They knew where the cousins had been taken, how the investigation finally came together, and why the man responsible would never sit across from a prosecutor. When the story reached the public, it did not explode the way some expected. There were headlines, brief surges of attention, and then a familiar quiet. The difference now was that silence no longer felt empty. It felt final. Law enforcement agencies conducted internal reviews, careful to frame them as learning opportunities rather than admissions of failure. Reports acknowledged limitations that existed in 1997, fragmented databases, underdeveloped forensic tools, and jurisdictional boundaries that slowed information sharing. None of it was incorrect. None of it erased the reality that opportunities had been missed. The torn photograph became central to understanding that reality. Investigators spoke openly about it during briefings, explaining how one preserved fragment had anchored the entire case. Without it, the cabin might have been demolished without notice. The ravine behind it might have remained just another fold in the mountains. The evidence was never truly gone. It had simply been placed where no one was looking. For the families, reflection came in quieter ways. Daniel's parents finally packed his room, carefully, over several days. They didn't discard anything. They labeled boxes. Luke's mother disconnected the phone number she had kept active for years, sitting with the silence afterward and letting it stay. Ethan's siblings visited the creek where the backpack had been found, no longer searching, just standing where part of the story had resurfaced. Emily's voicemail remained unchanged. Closure, it turned out, was not a single moment. It was a series of decisions. Some families chose to attend memorial services together. Others needed distance. Grief did not follow the same timeline for everyone, even now. A small memorial was placed near the edge of the old fairgrounds, where the lights once faded into darkness. It wasn't elaborate, just 4 names etched into stone, dates marking lives interrupted, and a brief line acknowledging the years between disappearance and discovery. People stopped there quietly. Some remembered the cousins. Some learned their names for the first time. The fair continued to return every summer. It always would. But now the story was told differently, not as a warning whispered after dark, not as speculation passed down through rumor, but as fact. Children were still allowed to roam, music still played, life moved forward. But the ground where the cousins were last seen no longer carried uncertainty. It carried memory. Investigators involved in the final phase of the case spoke candidly in private moments about how easily time reshapes assumptions, about how cases don't always go cold because they lack answers, but because those answers fall just outside the reach of the tools available at the time. The Harper case became a reference point, a reminder that persistence matters even when progress feels impossible. There was no trial, no sentencing, no public reckoning for the man responsible. That absence lingered, unresolved in its own way. Justice, in its purest sense, had not been served. Accountability had come too late. And yet, the truth stood. The cousins had not vanished into nothingness. They had been taken, hidden, and forgotten by someone who believed the mountains would keep his secret forever. He had underestimated time. He had underestimated what remains behind. In the end, it was not a confession or a witness that closed the case. It was a photograph, torn and buried, waiting beneath a floor that eventually gave way. The evidence did not disappear. It waited, and with it, the truth. Some mysteries end with answers, others end with understanding. This one ended with names restored, stories corrected, and a reminder that silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes it means something has been deliberately placed out of sight, trusting that no one will ever dig deep enough to find it.